And we're back. So thank you very much for coming in to track 4. For this session, it's brought to you by one of our partners, Acast, and I'm delighted to welcome Megan Davies to the stage. Megan, take it away.
Woo! You're just going to stay here then, huh?
Hello, we've got that awkward after lunch session, so people will start to filter in, I hope. But yeah, welcome to our session. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about translating your podcast into global successes, and also a little bit about what brands can be doing to be both kind of global, but with a localized vision at the same time. So it's not just me talking. But in fact, I'm joined today with my colleague, Adam Utman, who is our Creator Network Development Director, and our very special guest, Jamie East, the co-founder of Daft Doris Productions and the Smart 7 podcast, who are going to be talking to you a little bit later about how he's been localizing and extending the reach of his podcast, the Smart 7, into other markets. So a little bit of what's coming up. So some global trends with podcasting. I'm not going to start with one of those displays of how podcasts have boomed over the last year or so, because we all know that already. What we're going to do is delve a bit deeper into some of the global trends, but also some of the local and more regional trends around the world that we don't often talk about in podcasting. You'll find if you've ever started to research podcasting around the world, you'll get a huge amount of data around the UK and the US and possibly the Nordics, but you can struggle to find what's going on in the rest of the world. So we're going to look at that, and also with a little bit on how that relates to other parts of the world. So how can we look at what's going on in LATAM and think about how that translates to what's going on in Europe, and how should we be affected by that, and how should brands kind of work around that. Then we're going to look at what's the best approach for brands. Should they be looking at a global vision? Should they be adapting their messaging to a local market, to local languages? Yeah, there is 3 things that you should know about me. I really love podcasts. I am an absolute language nerd, and I like to travel. So I'm really, really excited to talk to you about how this all works, how you should localize, what the nuances are in different markets, and whether it's worth it, whether we should just be global. And then we have a great brand case study for you with some work that we did with the brand Ford last year, where we were looking to put together a podcast series in the English language and how we could make that work across multiple markets with the different language challenges. And then I am going to stop talking at the end of this, and Adam and Jamie will take over and discuss what they've been doing with the Smart 7 podcast. So first of all, global trends. So to jump right in, like I said, I'm not going to show you a massive graph, but we're just going to say that global podcast market size was valued in 2020 at 11.46 billion USD. And it's expected to expand at a CAGR rate of 31.1% between 2021 to 2028. So it's one of the world's fastest growing advertising channels, and that's why, of course, we're all in this room today to look at podcasting and what's going on within that. So let's look a little bit at how the growth of podcasts has looked, what the main trends have been that have been accelerating this growth, particularly what we've seen in the last 2 years, where obviously everybody's way of working has changed. So there's 4 key things. We could have picked out a few more, but there are 4 key trends that we've picked out to look at. So that's the rise of the celebrity podcast, big tech emergence in the podcast space, people with screen fatigue, which I think we can all agree is a huge thing over the last couple of years, and then comforting voices. Everybody has needed that comforting voice, that relationship with their podcast host or indeed maybe their radio host to listen to as things have been a bit unpredictable. So first of all, the rise of the celebrity podcast. So some of these will be familiar to you, I'm sure. When we think about the restrictions and what's happened over the last couple of years, it's been difficult to navigate for people creating TV, for people creating film, people creating any kind of media. And the beauty in podcasting is really the entry point is quite low. You need your kind of recording setup. If you have an internet connection and you can do a video call, you can interview your guests. And this has seen a rise with people like Louis Theroux, for example, Catherine Ryan, Anna Faris, all taking to podcasting as a medium to keep their content out there, keep producing, keep creating during the pandemic. And what's really interesting about this trend with celebrities taking to podcasting is that it's introducing a new audience into podcasting. So of course, we have all of the die-hard podcast fans that know exactly how to download and listen to a podcast, but there's a huge demographic out there that didn't know where to go to get a podcast before this. So seeing a household name and seeing people taking to podcasts who would otherwise be on a Netflix series or watched on TV has introduced a new demographic to podcasting, and that's been helping the audience size grow kind of all around the world. Another big trend that we saw was tech giants starting to invest big in podcasting. So this is really interesting. I mean, we all know Spotify, Amazon, Netflix, Sony have been investing greatly in podcasting, and why not? It's an amazing medium. And what's really interesting to see, though, is there is still value in those podcasts with a legacy audience, so those that have been releasing episodes for months and months and months and really kind of growing their bank of content and growing that loyal audience. And that's what's so important in podcasting, and why brands are keen to be involved in podcasting is because of this loyal audience that you are building with your fans. So the other trend that I spoke about, that everybody usually sighs about, is when we talk about Zoom fatigue, when we talk about screen fatigue. Like, it's no lie that people are staring at a screen all day, every day. And then what do you do when you turn off your laptop? Do you want to go and watch another screen? Do you want to be on your phone? When we did a study towards the end of 2021, 79% of global audiences were all in agreement that embracing digital audio as a way to combat screen fatigue and have something to just close your eyes and listen was super important. And so this only accelerated the growth even more over the last couple of years. And finally, this goes back to what I was saying about the loyal audience and that kind of authenticity between the host and the podcast audience, and why this is so important. People said that they provided companionship for them during the pandemic and beyond. You've got that voice of somebody you trust, somebody you've chosen to tune into. You're not bound by a certain programming schedule. You can listen to them when you want to, and it's that kind of friendly voice that you trust, that authenticity. And that's why it's so interesting for brands to be involved in podcasting, because it's kind of that authenticity that goes both ways. We want to know that the podcaster wants to work with the brand in the same way that the brand wants to work with the podcaster to maintain that relationship that they have with their audience. And the question that people ask me all the time when we're talking about this kind of subject is, okay, so it grew, but is this audience going to last? And a really interesting survey that you can see here from the IOB towards the end of 2021 was that 38% of those new listeners said that they were going to at least maintain the same listenership that they had during the pandemic, or perhaps even more. So this new audience that's found podcasting, whether it be for screen fatigue reasons or because they heard that a well-known person that they watch on TV usually has gone to podcasting, they're here to stay, and it's growing. Now, what I promised at the start was that we weren't just going to look at UK, US, and the markets we look at all the time, but actually look at where podcasting has been growing over the last couple of years. And you'll see that, so South Korea makes up one of the most listened to podcast markets in the world, with 58% of South Koreans listening at least once per month. So that is an enormous amount of people. And Spain, interestingly, a market where we recently launched in, 40% of Spanish say that they listened to podcasts regularly. And now when we look at the growth between Spain and LATAM, you'll see there's a bit of a link there as well. So just to end on this slide, $41.8 billion is the forecasted global podcast market by 2026. And where is that happening? Pretty much all over the world. I mean, we talk the Nordics, where we are right now, very well-established markets for podcasting, super, super popular here. But if you look, of course, across Australia, where we've been growing, across a lot of the rest of Europe, in France, in Spain, you'll see there's been massive growth, and that is continuing. So we're talking about the growth, and that's all well and good, but what's really, really cool about when we're growing an audience is that it's starting to diversify as well. So with more and more people coming into the podcast space, a new audience is coming up. So these are stats from our from the Infinite Dial US for 2022, but you can see, just as a representation of what's going on with podcasting, the audiences are starting to change. slowly, as you can see from 2011 through to 2021, you can see that there's a much bigger Hispanic audience starting to listen to podcasts in the US. You can see that the 55 plus age group is starting to grow, whereas it was predominantly kind of Gen Z millennial before. So this is really, really interesting to look at, and hopefully this is going to expand even more. Podcasting, like we said, relatively low entry point to doing this. It should be a platform for people to make their voices heard, and it should be a diverse audience listening. So that's continuing to grow, which is incredibly exciting. So as we were talking about the Hispanic audience, this is obviously accelerated by the amount of content that's going out across LATAM markets. So Mexico, gathering the most listeners in LATAM, and you'll see at the bottom there something enormous just to finish this slide off on. The overall growth in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil this year are set to surpass North America and Europe. So it's become an incredibly important region. And obviously, when we grow our content in LATAM, we've seen ourselves firsthand from our Mexican office signing content there. That translates to more listeners in Spain and in other Spanish-speaking markets. So it's important, yes, to look at for that region, but it's also incredibly important to look at for Europe as well and how it affects that. Just going to give a quick snapshot to APAC markets as well. So what's interesting with APAC markets is that there's a lot of technology leading this. So there are many markets that are starting to up their game with programmatic buying in audio. But based on a study towards the end of last year, they found that podcasts are actually making up 25% of programmatic buying across APAC, largely led by Australia, closely followed by India. So that's a trend that we're seeing pick up across the Asia-Pacific markets as well. And if you look just towards the bottom of the slide, in fact, when KPMG looked at the news podcast uptake in India, this is a trend that we've seen across a lot of Asia, that it is becoming one of the more trusted news sources as well. And again, going back to that kind of loyalty and authenticity within podcasting, people go there for their trusted news. So that's a really big trend that we see in those markets as well. And then finally, as we're in Europe, we'll finish up with that. So growing in popularity, as we all know, sitting in this room over the last couple of years. We've touched on Spain with their really high number of listeners. And the IAB is predicting that the advertising spend for podcasts is going to reach 207.2 million euros by 2025. So with all that in mind, should we be looking at global? Should we be looking at local campaigns? Just to give you a bit of background about where we're coming from at Acast, so we have over 40,000 podcasts, 380 million listens a month, a really, truly global presence to look at and dig into those figures and case studies. So, if we're thinking about making a global campaign, how do we do that? Well, this is a great example you can see here. So if you just take these 6 podcasts alone have the capacity to reach 14 million listeners per week in over 100 countries. So that's, for an advertiser's point of view, very little lifting to make their message heard all over the world. You can see some of the most listened to geos popping up there, but these are absolute powerhouses in terms of listenership worldwide. You've got The Intelligence from The Economist, you've got the FT News Briefing, you've got the BBC World Service podcasts there. So if you really want a huge reach globally, this is a very efficient way to do it. The beauty with podcasting being that there isn't really a limitation on where you can listen. Listen across an open ecosystem, on any listening app, wherever you are in the world, and you can reach your audience. But we all know that if we're talking about certain markets, there's going to be language issues that we run into. So there are some ways that we can get around this. So you can maintain these powerhouse podcasts and have this global reach. What we can also do is start to adapt and work with international news brands across the world. So for instance, a brand might want to take a sponsorship of TED Talks, but we also want to reach the Spanish-speaking world, so we adapt that for TED in Espanol as well. It can be the same that we want to run across The Economist in all English-speaking markets, and we want to adapt that message for France by adding in Les Echos podcast Le Story. So there are ways to do this, just using things like audio ads and adapting the languages. But what we've seen is really effective for a lot of brands that are running across multiple markets is to do a little bit of both. So using those podcasts for your reach, global reach, or pinpointing the markets that you want to be within, and then running a local collaboration for that higher engagement with some local language podcasts. So running sponsorships, dynamically inserted host reads within shows in your local language. So we might be running across the daily tech news show for a tech client, and we might want to combine that with Libros para Emprendedores for a Spanish-speaking audience of entrepreneurs and business people. So that's really, really feasible, and it means less lifting, less sign-off process, just less going on for a brand as well to be involved. They have a handful of local shows with a high engagement, and they have an enormous reach on the other side with the international shows. So as I mentioned earlier, an amazing example of this was a campaign that we ran with Ford the year before last. So this was all actually put together during lockdown, which was a challenge within itself. A lot of Zoom fatigue. But basically, Ford came to us and wanted to produce a podcast series that talked about how they were an innovative brand in motorsport technology, how they were shaping the future of performance within motorsport. Now, the challenge was that this was an amazing idea for a podcast, right? To talk about tech, we're talking about neuroscience techniques and incredible things happening within the innovation in motorsports. But the challenge is, how do you make that resonate with a UK, a French, and a German audience at the same time without spending a huge amount of budget in localizing every single piece of content? So here's what we did. So the creation of 5-episode original series with one of our production partners. Like I said, it was an amazing topic to talk about. We were going from everything from sustainability within the motorsports arena to technology, female athletes and the future of them in the sport. So we put that together in English language, hosted on Acast, distributed anywhere anybody gets their podcast. And then a multi-market promotional campaign, running local language ads on local shows, as well as running English language ads and sponsorships on our international biggest sports, tech, and other categories that fitted with the audience they were trying to reach. But of course, we were missing there the local language grasp, perhaps, for the French or the German market. So instead of recreating the whole series from scratch, what we did was work with Ford and some of our key shows within the French and German markets to actually produce a spin-off episode of their original show. So these were bonus episodes, bringing in a guest that Ford helped to source, and basically dedicating this episode to the subject matter, but in the same style that the show would usually be within. So just to be clear, this wasn't taking the show and making it a Ford production. This was integrating the brand into the episode and creating a bonus episode that was essentially a localized version of what we were doing with the podcast. So you can see the two shows that we worked with there, Le Rendezvous Tech, and I'm not going to attempt to say the German one because it will embarrass everybody in the room. But yeah, so we ran that for several months, leading through to the Dare to Create podcast, which if you haven't listened to and you were into anything to do with technology, motorsports, or just generally want to listen to a great podcast, it is a really interesting listen. But yeah, listen to the localized versions as well if you can, because it's a really great scope of how to just adapt content without, expending a huge amount of budget on retranslating everything and repurposing. And so the proof was in the pudding with it. So we did an in-depth brand study with Ford around how the campaign performed. One of the key messages of the campaign was to get across that Ford was an innovator that was shaping the future of motorsport. And in our brand study, concluded that there was a significant uplift in listeners to the show and to the spin-off episodes who agreed with the statement. So now, after talking about global podcasts for a while, I am going to hand you over to Adam and Jamie, who are going to come up and talk a little bit about the Smart 7 and what we've been doing there with localization of the show.
Thank you, Meg. I'll take that one. Oh. Thank you very much, Meg. Hello, everybody. Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Adam Utzman. I am the development director at Acast, working with Meg in the international team. So my role basically is to work with creators, work with podcasters to grow and develop their podcasts in our new markets, our emerging markets. It's a very exciting role, as you've just seen from what Meg said. The picture of podcasting globally is very exciting. To introduce this man here, some of you may know him, Jamie East. co-founder of Daft Doris, who are the creators of the Smart 7 podcast. Jamie, I'm going to quickly run through your CV.
Okay.
If I get anything wrong or anything's insulting, please tell me.
It's all insulting.
Well, first of all, you created Holy Moly.
Yeah.
Tell me about Holy Moly very briefly.
Holy Moly was the UK's biggest kind of celebrity gossip website from the years of like 2002 to 2012.
Yeah. So you sold that to Endemol Shine before becoming a presenter, producer, and journalist. You were part of the on-air roster for Virgin Radio's relaunch in the UK in 2016 before moving to
The glory
afternoons.
years.
The glory years, indeed. Before moving to afternoons on Talk Radio. So you have been a radio presenter as well. Your TV credits include Big Brother's Bit on the Side, Thronecast, Westworld, and of course, Celebrity Haunted Hotel.
I know. It's, yeah.
Apparently that means
I'll
something.
talk to you all about it later. It was a real high point.
Your finest moment in TV. You're a podcast veteran, I'm so sorry to use that term, but you've done podcasting before. You produced and presented chart-topping podcasts, including Jungle VIP, previously on What to Watch on Netflix, and 10 out of 10 would recommend. As a journalist, you've worked across the Sunday Times and Vice, and then in 2020 you became head of audio for Sporting News, creating a US sports audio network.
Correct.
Which we'll come back to. But what we're here to talk about today is the Smart 7. So your catchphrase is the world served up in 7 minutes.
Yeah.
And we're proud to work with you on that podcast at Acast. You launched it in the UK in April 2020.
Yep.
It's released every day at 7 o'clock.
Every day.
Including today.
Including today.
How did you manage that? You've been here since yesterday.
Well, you know, there's a laptop in a hotel. Wi-Fi is pretty good now. Microphones are quite small. I've got a little studio that we move around the world. It travels with me everywhere.
And that is the beauty of podcasting,
Yeah.
of course. You can do it wherever you are. When we went out for dinner last night, and am I allowed to say this?
I don't know. What are you going to say?
I don't know. I thought I'd take this off somewhere else, actually. You got quite some good news about numbers.
Oh yeah, we hit
a significant milestone last night.
Yesterday we hit 10 million downloads for the Smart 7 UK edition, which was good, quite timely as well. Yeah, it was good to get that text.
So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
You have sister titles including the Sports 7, the Science 7, and also the Irish edition of the Smart 7. You launched a German edition on May the 2nd. So we're going to talk a bit about that concept of launching and repurposing your content for new markets. But first of all, just tell us where the idea for the Smart 7 podcast originated in the first place.
Well, I was producing podcasts for Netflix and for Sky and for HBO and a couple of kind of white label clients, and through that came into conversation with your usual suspects, the Apples and the Spotifys of the world. And one thing that was clear was that short and daily was something that was on the horizon, was growing, and also there was no one else really doing it. And Liam and I, who worked together at Virgin Radio in a few years before, kind of bashed our heads together, and within 10 minutes came up with the concept of the Smart 7, including the name, including all the segments and the kind of the whole format of it. It was a pretty straightforward pitch to each other. Really, it immediately filled a gap. The only people that were doing it were big newspaper corporations and some kind of, were radio stations doing it? Maybe a little bit, but nothing really particularly good. So Liam and I's idea was, if you took the format of a radio breakfast show bulletin and formatted that into a daily news podcast, and as yesterday's talks said, created habit, you know, it was pretty, I don't want to say fail safe, but it was always going to work. And it was always our intention to be the podcast that you listen to on the way to the train or on the way to your commute. We weren't trying to replace people's habitual kind of like 45-minute, hour-long listens, because there's no point, it's too difficult. So the Smart 7 was a way of, by the time you get on the bus, you already know what's going on in the world.
Yeah, spot on. And actually, my example, I listen to it quite regularly. The time it takes me from walking home from where I drop my son off to school to my house is exactly 7 minutes.
There we go.
So I get a really quick snapshot of the day, and then I get on with the rest of the day.
I mean, in hindsight, we wish we'd chosen the Smart 8. We'd have got an hour later in bed, but...
So there was an obvious gap, is your point.
Yeah.
Growing podcasts is hard.
It's really, really hard.
But
It is.
you've made this successful in the UK. How what were the tricks that you used there?
I mean, really, it's common sense stuff. It's make it sound good. I'm sure everybody here is well aware that 99.9% of podcasts sound really bad. They just do. And without offending anybody, a lot of radio podcasts just don't sound as though there's a whole lot of work gone into it. So we spent a lot of time on the imaging, on the sound, on the EQ, on making it sound like a lush production that you would expect. And that makes it easy on the ears. But then you've just got to get into regularity. It's a big undertaking. We launched this in April 2020. We launched a podcast for commuters, probably in the first time in the history of commuting where no one was commuting. But you just have to get on with it. We saw it as a soft launch, and actually we were surprised by how quickly people adapted it into their daily routines, whether they were working from home or homeschooling, or indeed when they started going back to work as well. So it's not easy, but nothing good should be, really. It's about getting up and putting the hours in the same way as creating a great radio show is. It doesn't come easily. It doesn't come quickly. You have to grind away at it and tweak and feedback and all the stuff that makes a great radio show is exactly the disciplines that we applied to the Smart 7.
Yeah, and think long term, of course.
Yeah, and our business side of things, we always knew that we wanted to take the Smart 7 and expand it globally, and knew that it would be, I'm not going to say really easy, but relatively straightforward to do.
Yeah. And so on that note, you had success in the UK.
Yeah.
Through hard work, finding a gap and everything else you just said. What made you decide to then localize for new audiences? Because you're in Ireland, you've just launched in Germany. What drove you to do that? Where did you see the opportunity?
I think with daily news podcasts, it's surprising how many of those news stories carry across different territories and different markets. There's, especially around Europe. So we launched in Ireland about a year ago as, I guess, a litmus test to see how it worked. Liam comes from Ireland. We have, contacts within Ireland. We knew how to kind of get it off the ground, and also it was the closest to us in terms of content. So we always knew that, if we took, let's say, 2/3 of what we put out on the UK edition and wrap that up with a local voice, and also the most important local stories of that day, it's surprising how different the episode sounds and how much it sounds like a completely fresh episode. So we knew that would work. So we tried it with Ireland, and it worked. And then the next kind of giant leap was to attempt that with a non-English speaking kind of territory. And then we chose Germany as the first one.
So that's interesting, because Ireland feels like a natural next step. You mentioned your business partner Liam is from Ireland, so and it's very close to the UK, so there's a natural progression there. Why Germany in particular? And also, did you record a German version this morning in your hotel room?
I didn't do the German version, no, thankfully. I think Martin is in the room, and he certainly did. That's Martin Liss from Podcast 360, who's our German partners with the Deutsch edition. Why Germany? Well, we have a great relationship with you guys. Acast, and I don't want to blow smoke at their backsides too much, but they've been a great partner to us. They've been great mentors and helped us in shaping and growing the title. And it was a collaborative discussion with you guys that identified Germany as certainly being, I guess, not necessarily an underserved market in daily news, because there are a lot of daily news podcasts in Germany, but one that had the Smart 7 sensibilities, which, to those of you that haven't listened to the Smart 7, you'll all listen to it afterwards, I'm sure. It's vibrant, it's got personality, it's balanced, which you don't often get. It's surprising how few news podcasts actually have balance in them. They usually come from a right-wing or a left-wing newspaper, whereas ours is completely independent, so it allows us to kind of sail right in between. But Germany was identified as, growing in terms of listenership, and the commercials made a lot of sense as well. In relation to the rest of Europe, CPM, it's double the CPM that the UK gets. which is music to an independent podcaster's ears, really.
So you had the data, you had the insights. We obviously helped you at Acast to identify that market, and you felt that Germany was the right place. I'm interested to know about the process that goes. You make the UK version yourself. Still, you are the presenter.
Yeah.
But you have a partner in Germany
Yeah.
that makes the German version. Is this scalable? How much crossover is there between what you're doing for the UK version and the German version, or are they completely standalone?
No, it wouldn't be economically, or it'd be too time and labor intensive, and would cost too much money just to create two completely separate episodes. The whole point of localizing it and the vision right from the offset, and it's something that we translated into our US sports titles as well, is that you have to be able to take a certain amount of those stories and globalize them. And it's really interesting, with working with Martin and Podcast 360, of how interested Germany are in Partygate and Wagatha Christie. It's kind of like, you'd be amazed. There's the similarity. We look for the similarities rather than the differences. There are stories that Germany have to cover that the UK wouldn't necessarily cover because we don't really know about it. There's a whole thing about travel cards in today's episode where everyone can travel on the trains in Germany for €9, which is a huge story for Germany, but wouldn't really resonate with the UK audience. And then in the same breath, we had a Eurovision story, both at item 2, but UK and Germany's obviously had a slightly different journalistic angle on those ones. Sorry.
So they're all the positives.
Yeah.
What about the challenges of producing
Well,
different versions in different markets?
I mean, the obvious one is language. I think culturally, Germany and UK aren't too far apart. We have the same kind of sensibilities. I suspect the further we go from the UK, we're looking, maybe into the Far East or certainly into LATAM, where cultural or religious kind of interest start to take over. There's less interest in a kind of UK-centric list of titles. But the language is the big one. Without going into too much detail under the bonnet, our editors are based in the UK. We have production staff that are in Ireland, that are in the UK, that are in Germany as well. We've developed the format so that an editor that doesn't speak German can pull together the edit of the German podcast in 10, 15 minutes. And so it's about trusting the process. But there has been a challenge, and we're still challenging ourselves daily, shall we say.
And you're ambitious because you do want to go into new markets, don't you? As you just talked about, knowing the challenges, what next markets would you like to go into?
Well, I mean, once it's like having children. Once you've had 2, you may as well have 4. So
I've got 3.
Well, just get on with it, mate. 4's no different.
Nope, not doing it.
We trust our process. We know that we've got a good format, and we know that people listen to it and listeners respond to it. And we also know, and we've proved to ourselves twice now, that we can carry that across into completely different markets. So, as Megan's talk just said, we'd be foolish not to be looking at LATAM next. It's kind of 2 for 1. I think if we crack a Spanish-speaking one, then, the overflow of that, Mexico and Brazil would be, quite nice to have on board as well.
Yeah, so let's say Spain. Let's say Spain was next.
But again, culturally very different to UK and Germany and Ireland, so we would have to work out, how much of that to translate, or would that have to become a new hero hub for the Smart 7?
Yeah, and I was going to ask there that if it were to be Spain next, what are the things that you then have to think about and put in place? Are you going to have to find a team to help you make that in Spain, as you have done Germany, to work with the language side of things?
Yeah, I mean, Germany would have been almost impossible to have done without having a local partner. As much as you have writers on the ground or editors on the ground, you can't beat having someone out there living it, understanding what the public mood is for different stories, whether that's politics or sport or entertainment. So in order to look for somewhere as culturally different as Spain or LATAM, we would be looking for a production partner with that. But it lessens the load on both sides. We handle the brand and the format. Liam and I often talk. I was a big admirer of how they expanded Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and the X Factor across so many different territories, yet still retaining those core brand values. And that's something that we're applying to the podcasting world.
That's interesting. So if there are any people in the room or elsewhere that have a podcast brand that's doing well in their local markets and they may be thinking about what they could do elsewhere, what advice, what tips would you give them for expansion?
Do as much as you can. Do as much as you can yourself, but also kind of be self-aware enough to know when you've got to hand it over to someone who knows better. I think it sounds pretty obvious, but there were a moment. Do we try and find a German-speaking host that lives in the UK? And that wouldn't have worked. But we are launching in Australia for one of our sports titles. And we have an Australian host that lives in the UK that's well known in Australia as a sports journalist, but happens to live in the UK. And actually, that plays into our hands perfectly because of the time difference. So we get to do a podcast at 6 p.m. rather than 5 a.m., which is just like
your days are going to be long.
The days are going to be.
And actually, on that note, because we're talking specifically about the Smart 7, but you rightly pointed out that you have a load of other sister podcasts and publications. So you're starting to use this model with them as well then?
Yeah, I mean, Sporting News in the States came to us a couple of years ago. They hired me to be the head of audio because they were regrouping. They'd split off from DAZN. There's a whole load of corporate stuff going on there, and came to us saying, we have no audio strategy, but we love what you've done with Daft Doris and the Smart 7. So they've invested in Daft Doris as a company, and as part of that, Liam and I now produce 2, soon to be 5, 7 branded sports podcasts for them, and that's sports is a lot easier. Sports is a lot simpler than regular news. Sports is linear. Someone wins, someone loses, someone moves teams. That's it. That's all that ever happens in sport. News is a lot more subjective, and you have to lean into cultural differences. But with sport, everyone knows who Man United is, and you either love them or hate them. That's it makes life relatively straightforward to write them.
Yeah. My final question to you, and actually it's kind of based on all that stuff, you're clearly very busy. You have a lot of podcasts going on. You're thinking about new versions of the podcasts that you have. You've worked across all forms of media. As I said at the beginning, is podcasting now your thing? And the big question that everybody wants to know about a podcaster, is this your living? Are you making enough money out of it to make it your thing long term?
Yeah, I mean, I've done TV, radio, writing, all of the above. There's no reason you can't do more than one. I think as most of the voices up there have proved, whether you're Peter Crouch or Fern Cotton, you can spread yourself across lots of things. But I enjoy podcasting. I like the relationship that you have with the listener. It's weirdly even more intimate than radio. Sorry, it is. You have a more carefully crafted relationship with your listener, and a more loyal one as well. It's easier to form a habit with a daily news podcast than it is with a breakfast show. I'll tell you that for nothing. So yeah, I mean, podcasting is all I'm doing at the moment, and yeah, if you do it right, you can absolutely make a living out of it. You'd be doing it wrong. We hit 700th episode today of the Smart 7. If we weren't making a living from it, we'd be really stupid to do 701.
I think that's a fair point. Well, it sounds like it's all going brilliantly for you. We're very pleased to work with you on the Smart 7.
Likewise, thank you. Couldn't
Long may it
without
continue. Congratulations on your 10 millionth download and your 700th episode. It's a fantastic achievement, and I'm really pleased to hear that you're making a living out of it, because that's what's not the only reason you do it, but it helps.
It is. Thank you.
Turned your hobby into an actual career. Well, I think we've probably got a couple of minutes. If anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask for Jamie, if anyone does, there's a
I'm not going to talk about Celebrity Haunted Hotel, though.
What is it? No, don't tell me. I'm not interested.
Hi, I'm Kaisa from Swedish Radio. I was wondering if you see any role for video in your podcasts.
Well, yeah, the video is the shadow that is cast across all podcasting, I think. I think video works really well in conversational podcasting. It just does. You know, it's a great promotional medium. I'm yet to be convinced of just sticking up a 2-hour-long episode on YouTube, but it works for Joe Rogan. Who's going to argue with that? I think for what we do, we're looking at ways of incorporating that. But the format of Smart 7, you know, we use audio clips from press conferences, from interviews. It would be, we've experimented. It's tricky, and I'm not sure that you need to see my face at 7 o'clock in the morning. You know, the beauty of doing the Smart 7 from home at 5 o'clock in the morning is that no one gets to see what I look like when I'm doing it. If the minute there's a camera on, it creates a whole set of problems. But I think if the format's right, and look, you know, TikTok is going to destroy everybody eventually. So ignore it at your peril. But it's what that looks like, I think, is key. The temptation just to shove a video version of whatever you're doing in audio is just wrong. And, you know, all those lovely little cameras in your radio studios, they just end up never being used properly, I think. And this would be a good example of not to do, I think, anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think this lady had a question as well, didn't you?
Hi, I'm Ella. I work for News UK, so with Times, we have several.
Hi.
Hi.
It's our Daily Drive friends.
So lots of news podcasts, and I was wondering how you make most of your income. With news, we find people want to capture the audience, the curious audience, as advertisers. So people doing a lot of dynamic advertising, but less keen on sponsorship and attaching their name to stories that can be quite dark. And about the news of the world that can be very sad. So a lot of sponsors aren't keen on just having their name next to it. Have you found this a similar issue? Where are you finding most of your income's coming from on a advertiser level?
Well, we found the opposite, actually.
Really?
Yeah. And I think you get out of it what you put into it. And that's, you know, I'm sitting having to get News UK. I've worked there for many, many years, and probably will again. We all end up working for him again one day. It's just the inevitable. We have found that we've had great success with our dynamic reads, our sponsorship pluses, all of that kind of stuff, because we make them dynamic and fun. You know, if you listen to some of our ads that we've done, you know, I've recorded sponsorship reads with the kids in the car on the school run because it was a sponsorship for Kia. You know, I've recorded like being on a run. We had a great one for Weetabix a couple of weeks ago, where you weren't allowed to mention the word mushy. If you've ever tried to do a read for Weetabix without mentioning the word mushy, it's a skill in itself. So we've found that I think the Smart 7 is different to a lot of news brands, and I include like the Times in that, whereby the Times is the Times. It's got a lot of heritage, and most news brands carry this kind of like gravitas and sensibilities. We cover the same stories you do, but it's done with a trumpet fanfare and a bit of a cheeky kind of read. So we've found that brands actually want to get on board with that. So, I mean, the split, I think, is pretty even in terms of programmatic and sponsorship. But the feedback that we get from the brands is that they kind of like it when we go a bit off-piste. You know, it's the same with anything in radio. You know, if you're doing any collaboration with brands, you know, they have no ideas, so bring the ideas to them. They never have any ideas. So they set a very low benchmark. So get in there with creativity, and they think you're the second coming. It's amazing.
That's really helpful, thank you.
It's all right. We do white labels, so just hit us up. We can do your ads for you.
I think we're out of time, unless anyone has any more quick questions. I think we're probably it. Well, listen, Jamie, thank you very much for your time. It's
Pleasure.
really
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.